Welcome to the Culture Lab. I'm your host, Aga Bayer. This podcast helps you turn your company culture into rocket fuel for meaningful growth. It explores how we can make the word work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging. It looks at how we can build remarkable cultures that scale as our businesses grow and the world keeps on changing.
It is absolutely fine to be afraid of missing a deadline, or afraid of harming a patient, or afraid of letting down a colleague. All of those things are okay. It's not okay to be afraid of each other. And it's not okay to be afraid of the boss. It's not okay to be afraid to speak up with work-relevant ideas that may or may not be on target, right? We've got to be willing to take those interpersonal risks.
Hey everybody! So June is LGBTQ Pride Month, and I want to give a big shout out to all my LGBTQ friends and team members. And I really want to say from the bottom of my heart how much I appreciate your contributions to making the workplace suck less and be more inclusive and respectful towards everyone. I think as a society, we've certainly made some progress in honoring the contributions of the LGBTQ workforce. But I also know that there are minds, hearts, teams, and companies that don't really engage, and where people, irrespective of what group they identify with, where people don't experience psychological safety. And so I thought that it would be extremely relevant and appropriate to release my interview with the mother of psychological safety, Amy Edmondson. Just a quick note, this episode is a rerun and was recorded a while ago, and there are some references that may seem a little out of date, but the content, it's more relevant than ever. Enjoy. Amy, welcome to the Culture Lab.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. I want to preface it by saying that I interviewed around 70 people for this podcast, and our main focus, as you know, has always been cultivating a culture where people can do their best work. And a topic that has consistently come up in all of these conversations was psychological safety, or the opposite of it, the culture of fear. So I'm sure that our listeners will understand why I'm so thrilled to welcome you as a guest. Thank you again for making the time to chat.
Oh, I am really looking forward to it.
Same here. So before we explore the topic of psychological safety and its impact on culture, let me ask you the question I always start with. What were the early cultural influences that shaped you as a person? In other words, what made Amy Amy?
Well, I grew up in New York City. I had all of my grandparents nearby and cousins and everybody else. I grew up in a Catholic family, which was very service-oriented, very much about making a better world. So I think those were that sort of strong family proximity and interest in a massive, cosmopolitan city, but with really an emphasis on what can I do to make things better, are probably the influences that most shaped me.
Yeah. And you are doing that. Our paths crossed at the Thinkers 50 Awards Gala, and you were recognized there with the Breakthrough Idea Award. So first of all, congratulations.
Thank you.
And I loved your acceptance speech, and particularly one of your closing remarks, which was that this idea has been breaking through for decades, right?
Indeed. I got a little bit of a laugh out of this being a Breakthrough Idea Award, in that it's something that I stumbled into quite by accident more than 20 years ago. And I did quite a bit of pretty good research, and then other people picked up the construct and did lots of additional research. And so, as I said then, and we'll say again, it's taken 20 years to break through.
And I think it's a really interesting case study in a way, because now everyone is talking about psychological safety, but it wasn't always the case. And I think for some of our listeners who are entrepreneurs or creative people, or people working in organizations on big ideas that need a lot of time to break through, I would really be curious, what kept you going? Because I can't imagine that it has been easy at the beginning.
Well, I didn't, it's not as if I just was beating my head against the wall. My papers were getting accepted in good journals. I was doing well as a scholar and a teacher, and that's my job. So
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't frustrating. I mean, one doesn't expect to get sort of global real world recognition for scholarly work very often. So not getting it wasn't a disappointment. And I also didn't just, I have to put this in context because it wasn't as if I was just pursuing this one variable and pursuing it doggedly all the time. I was constantly trying to understand what makes organizations today as effective and learning oriented and agile as they can possibly be. And one answer to that broad question is through ongoing, very effective teaming. And so I I spent a lot of time trying to describe and understand what allows people to team up effectively and get complex and especially new things done, innovative things done. And psychological safety is one of the conditions that allows effective teaming. It's not the only condition, clearly. So it's just, as you said earlier, now the idea of psychological safety is getting so much traction, but it's got to be put in a broader context, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I think the first time I did a deep dive into your work was around teaming when I was working still in PwC and leading a team there. And I remember we had one of our annual workshops and we talked about how we can work more effectively. And I remember sharing with my team the video that you still have on YouTube where you talk about teaming, and everyone loved that idea. And I think especially for teams in consulting that come together for a short period of time and then they dissolve and then work with other people, it was so incredibly relevant and so helpful for us.
Oh, that's wonderful to hear. And you've captured it exactly right. That what I was trying to do was just shift more of the emphasis from the noun team to the verb teaming, because it just struck me in the research I was doing in organizations in various industries that the stable, well-designed team was increasingly becoming a thing of the past. Because of the nature of work today, because we have 24/7 operations or complex and shifting projects, we often have new people joining a collaboration over time and other people rotating off. Or sometimes we have encounters where we just have to come together quickly, share expertise, share ideas, and get something done. And there's never a stable team formed in the middle of it. It's just the teaming.
Absolutely. And I know that as you were exploring what makes teams effective, you basically stumbled upon this idea of psychological safety. So, as you said, it wasn't that it was just one idea that you were pursuing, but also it wasn't something that you intentionally looked for. It kind of happened that you discovered it. So could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yes, and you describe it well, but I was interested in a general sense, I was interested in the learning organization. How do we learn? And of course, one of the things that the learning organization needs is the capacity to learn from mistakes. So I was very excited to be invited to join a team of medical researchers who were studying medication errors in two local hospitals. And that was just a great opportunity because I thought, well, mistakes, learning, it's all related. I'm going to get in there and I'm going to understand it better. And I wasn't looking for, but I stumbled into by accident, quite profound differences in reporting climate, which I later really will refer to as psychological safety climate. But that belief that, sure, things go wrong, and not only should I speak up about them, but I can speak up about them. And the reason people are willing to do that is, of course, they know that the only way to get better and the only way to provide high quality, safe, error-free care is to catch and correct errors early. And so, it was something that made sense to me, but I think I hadn't originally put quite enough emphasis on how hard that is for people in organizations, to speak up about errors.
Mm.
Errors are threatening, and especially in a hierarchy. If you have people who are evaluating you and who are above you in various ways in the status hierarchy, it can be extremely challenging to speak up honestly about things that go wrong. And yet, what I was finding was that some units, some teams did, and some didn't. And so I wanted to understand that better.
It's fascinating, and I want to unpack a little bit what you've just shared with us, because as you said, it's interesting because it seems like the teams that seem to be more effective, they reported more errors, and they felt like they could talk about those things. And this has been my experience as well, being an employee in organizations and managing people and then being a consultant, that people will very often say, well, I really can't do that. I can't tell my boss this. Why do you think this happens?
I love that you said can't, because that's exactly right. People don't experience it as, ooh, doesn't feel right, or I choose not to. They feel it as an impossibility. They feel that they just can't speak up with a mistake or a crazy idea or a need for help or any of those things that I would label interpersonally threatening. And yet in others they can. And as you said, in that medication error study, I had access. I distributed the team diagnostic survey that was developed by Richard Hackman. It's quite a validated survey. It's been had already been widely used at that time. It still is widely used today, and it assesses various properties of teams that kind of make them good teams. Clarity of goal, appropriateness of composition, access to the resources they need to do their work, um, available coaching to keep the team on track, and so on. And so I expected going into the study to find that better teams, better led teams, would have fewer errors. I mean, that makes sense for so many reasons. And in fact, that very thing has been shown in the aviation setting. That better teams, better cockpit crews have fewer errors in simulators where they can track the errors objectively. And so I had hoped to find the same thing. And when I first got my data, the survey data, then got to correlate them with the error data, the results seemed to suggest just the opposite. In other words, the so-called better teams had higher error rates, which at first seemed, very surprising and also quite disconcerting. We really don't want to have a finding that says, great teams in hospitals, according to this validated instrument, are out there making more mistakes. And then it suddenly occurred to me, wait a minute, maybe they're more, maybe great teams are more comfortable talking about error. As I thought about it, I suddenly realized maybe the better teams understand the nature of healthcare delivery, which is by its very nature complex and error prone and fast changing. But they understand that error is inevitable, and they also understand that to do good work and keep patients safe, they need to speak up, early and often. They need to work together. They need to be utterly transparent and, not about themselves, but about the work and about the patients. And indeed, so that was my new hypothesis, was that there were differences in workplace culture that contributed to differences in willingness to speak up about work relevant issues, and that was clearly important, not only for the delivery of good work, but also for ongoing learning and innovation. And it took me a while to um, find a term in the literature that seemed to capture this phenomenon of very low fear at work, interpersonal fear. So I then wondered whether, because this was just speculative and by accident. And so my next task as a researcher was to figure out whether I could measure this thing, these differences in interpersonal climate. And if so, did teams, even within the same organization, vary? Because we're used to thinking of corporate culture as homogenous within an organization. But I think interpersonal climate, climate for speaking up, varies between groups within the same organization because it's very subject to local influences,
Yes.
how this group behaves, how this leader behaves, and so forth. And indeed, I could measure it. Indeed, it varied significantly across teams. And this second study was in a manufacturing organization in the US. And it predicted learning behaviors such as asking questions, speaking up, offering ideas, experimenting. And in turn, it also predicted team performance.
This is so fascinating. And I am so glad that you stumbled upon it because it really did change the way we think about what makes an effective team and what makes an effective organization. And later on, of course, people like Duhigg have come up with articles that have been read by a lot of people because of being published in, I think, New York Times. It was for the first time about the Google study and so on and so forth. But if you haven't done that research, I don't think that it would have been possible for these people to popularize those ideas. And finally, we have your latest book in our hands, The Fearless Organization. And I love this title. And at the same time, I think it can be slightly misleading. And I know that you don't advocate that we get rid of all types of fear, or you don't deem it possible even, I think.
Correct.
So tell us a little bit, what is exactly a fearless organization?
Well, a fearless organization is either a profound exaggeration or an ideal state that we'll never reach. And yet, even that isn't quite right to say it's an ideal state. I want to clarify that it is absolutely fine to be afraid of missing a deadline, or afraid of harming a patient, or afraid of letting down a colleague. All of those things are okay. It's not okay to be afraid of each other. Right? It's not okay to be afraid of the boss. It's not okay to be afraid to speak up with work relevant ideas that may or may not be on target, right? We've got to be willing to take those interpersonal risks. So, maybe, wouldn't it be it would not be a very interesting book title to say the Low Interpersonal Risk Organization. No, nobody would buy that book. So
yeah, I don't think so.
Yeah, the fearless organization is meant to sort of capture your curiosity and then say, okay, I'd like to know more about that. And what does that mean? But it's, being afraid to miss a deadline, let's say, is generally the kind of fear that you can share. And I would say any shareable fear is probably okay. When we're teaming up together to, try to do the very best we can because we really care, we don't want to, let somebody down, etc. That's okay because we're in it together. It's when that private, lonely, interpersonal fear is quite crippling, and especially in knowledge work.
Yes, this is such an important clarification, because I think that, by saying it's okay to be afraid of missing a deadline, it's okay of to be afraid of harming a patient, and you say shareable fears versus those interpersonal fears where you feel like it's simply not safe to share your opinion. It's such a different type of fear. And um, in your book, you say that no 21st century organization can afford to have a culture of fear. So I understand that you mean a culture of interpersonal fear. But why would you say that? Why do you feel that, especially now, especially with knowledge workers, we really cannot afford it?
Probably the best way to explain it is to consider the opposing case. So imagine, if you will, a task or a kind of work that can be done individually. I do it alone. I don't have to interact with you. Transparently, meaning you can look at what I've done and say whether I did or didn't do a good job. It's objective and transparent. Then you can probably speculate that fear-based management will work, right? Because I can just tell you, if you don't get this done, something bad is going to happen to you. I'm not going to pay you. I'm not going to promote you, whatever it is, and I'm afraid, and I got to do this myself. And you know exactly whether I did it and how well I did it. But now consider how few jobs look like that anymore. I mean, essentially none. Nearly all of us are to some degree interdependent with other people. I need to be unafraid to ask for your help, to ask for your input, to run this by you, and so forth. And almost everything we do can be done, I could do even better, if I were really motivated, really engaged, and really care in ways that you can't command. You can't see the difference between, you might have some sense of it, but you can't see immediately that I have or haven't done my job right. You can't discern the difference between a kind of a 6 and a 9 or a 10 in my performance. You don't know whether I could have put more energy into satisfying that client, or whether I could have come up with an even more creative set of ideas. Those are non-observable performance differences. And so fear has no place in the modern organization, meaning interpersonal fear, because we are interdependent and things are uncertain and things are quite subject to our willingness to really engage and bring our full selves forward.
Yeah. And it's, in the context, especially, I think, of the recent developments, futurists say that the next 20 years will bring more changes for humanity than the past 300 years. So I think that we have so much volatility and so much uncertainty that is coming at us from the outside. So if we, on top of that, layer it with interpersonal fears, it's just paralyzing. So I can imagine that none of the organizations would be able to adapt to the current environment. If they need, what people need to deal with and think about is, how do I basically cover my back here, and what do I need to do, right, to be safe and not to lose my job?
Right. It's the difference. I mean, if you think about what's required of us, and especially as you point out with the rapid change and the increasing rate of change, we simply can't afford to have some portion of our brains busy reading the tea leaves, busy trying to figure out, whether it's okay to say this or say that. That's consuming brain cells that we don't have to spare.
Yes, absolutely. What is your favorite example of organizations where things went wrong? Your book is full of fantastic case studies, but I was wondering, which one do you feel is the most illustrative of the consequences of not having psychological safety?
I think the VW Dieselgate comes to mind because it's such a classic story of great ambition. And let's be clear, I'm in favor of ambition, right? I'm in favor of stretch goals. I'm in favor of companies trying to solve technological and social problems that are, really, really challenging. And that was a story of great ambition. They wanted to have a green car that everybody wanted to drive, and that passed, of course, had to pass the regulatory requirements. And the fear-based, especially top management culture, got in the way because it was clear about what the goal was. This must happen or else. And literally executives would say things like, I have your names, there will be consequences. And And so what happened instead of the actual goal, as we all know now, was the development by engineers of software to cheat the regulators, to make it look like the emissions were what they needed to be, because technologically they couldn't produce the engine to actually have the
Mm.
emissions where they needed to be. And so think about what it must feel like, to be working in an organization where it seems more reasonable to develop software to cheat regulators than to simply tell your boss this can't be done at the present time.
Yeah.
That's got to be quite painful. And
Mm.
and the like all of these stories, it looks for a while like it's working, and people and organizations seem to be getting away with it. So fear looks like it works.
Mm-hmm.
And then, we set the standards high. We told people there'd be consequences, and lo and behold, they gave us what we wanted. Yes, and
Mm-hmm.
eventually, this illusion of good performance will be revealed. Like all illusions, it will be clear that it was an illusion, a lie. And then the
Mm.
scandal is far worse than the performance challenges in the first place.
Yeah. And so would it be fair to say that's probably one of the reasons that we still have so many fear-driven cultures in our business environment today is because companies are so focused on short-term results? Because
Yes,
I'm thinking, for a CEO who knows that he or she is going to be there just for 2 years or 3 years, probably pushing it a little bit, they can get away with getting things done through fear for such a short period of time.
it's true. And to be fair to them, although I'm never a fan of people trying to get performance to look good in the short term, knowing that when they leave, it'll come crashing down. But I think oftentimes the top executives are simply blind. I mean, they don't know, right? It looks like it's working, so they actually believe it's working. They don't
Yeah.
necessarily believe they've set up a time bomb.
Hmm.
They think, hey, great car, looks beautiful to
Yes.
me,
Yeah.
and it seems to work and everybody's happy. So they're not getting feedback loops that would help
Mm.
them shift their behavior. And then I think also they're not thinking it through. They're not thinking through the question of, when do you do your best work? It's certainly not in
Hmm.
a state of panic. And it's
Yes.
certainly not in a situation where you can't ask for help when something's not working. I mean, those are not the conditions that any one of us would willingly put ourselves in. So it stands to reason we shouldn't put other people in them either.
Hmm. So let's talk a little bit about this blindness and how you can prevent that from happening. So putting ourselves in the shoes of a CEO or an executive in an organization, what can you do to prevent this from happening? So basically not really knowing what's
Mm.
happening because people simply don't tell you that they are faced with problems.
In the Fearless organization, I quote Mark Costa, who is the CEO of Eastman Chemical, which is a $10 billion global specialty chemical company. And he said in our classroom, he said, and I just loved it. I wrote it right down. He said, my greatest fear as a CEO is that I won't know what's going on. And
Mm.
and I think that's very wise. And so if you're aware that it is a risk for you and for the company and for customers, if you're unaware of things that are going on, then you'll be motivated to go out of your way to find out what's going on. And if you really want to find out what's going on, you're going to have to find out through a genuine spirit of curiosity and humility that's going to lead you to ask good questions and listen thoughtfully to the responses. And in
Mm.
many ways, that's the best answer to your question, which is, if you really want to know, you don't want to be blind, you don't want to be caught unawares, you've got to be first realizing I don't know, and then
Mhm.
second going out to find out. Walking
Mhm.
through the plants, walking through, and in a roll up your sleeves, curious, want to know more, want to understand what's going on here.
Yeah. And I think also sometimes admitting that I don't know
Oh yes,
because,
yeah.
yeah.
And
Absolutely.
I'm first of all, if you're in an engineering company, your engineering skills are likely not as strong as the people who've just come out of the top technical schools
Yeah.
and who are doing the real work of the organization. So you ought to be curious, respectful, want to know what's happening, want to learn as much as you can about what's possible, and just as important, what's not yet possible.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I love that. And that is such a powerful question, I guess, because hearing from the organizations I work with, probably the most frustrating question for a lot of CEOs is, this cannot be done.
Mm-hmm.
and
Right,
they
right.
try to push through it. And when they get this answer from their teams, they say, well, it's resistance to change. But sometimes, as you say,
Right. Which might
things
be the
really
wrong
can't be done.
diagnosis. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So they, what it is that they reflexively interpret the phrase, this can't be done, as an effort problem rather than
Mm.
as a, state of technology problem.
Mm-hmm.
It may very well be that, if you're in drug discovery, for example, Mother Nature won't allow this right now. If you're
Yes.
in technology, that the state of engine technology isn't there yet. We'd love to be the first ones to get there, but the only
Mm-hmm.
way to make that happen is through this very learning-oriented, curious, innovative culture, and to spontaneously diagnose the deficit as an effort problem, meaning people just aren't trying hard enough, is quite human, quite natural, and quite problematic.
So you've spoken really clearly about what a senior executive can do to start cultivating that culture of psychological safety. And what advice would you have for those of our listeners who are not in a formal position of power? Can they do anything? And if yes, what?
Yes, they certainly can do things as well. I mean, I think it's very human to sort of think, oh, I'm not the boss. What can I do? I can't do anything. And yet anyone can make a small difference in the interpersonal climate where they work. You do that by expressing curiosity. You do it by asking a colleague a question. You can also do it by asking a manager a question. I mean, a genuine, curious question about how you see something. It doesn't have to be a question like, you know, you might not want to ask. Many people would feel uncomfortable asking their manager. They shouldn't, but they might. What can I don't know how to do this yet. Can you help? Even though I'm actually in favor of that. But you can always ask, and you should ask, how do you think about this? Like, how are you seeing this situation? And that, more importantly, can be asked of any colleague, and then followed by really careful listening. Because one of
Mm-hmm.
the biggest gifts that any one of us can give to anyone else is the gift of listening. And
Mm.
when you're listening to someone, you are automatically giving them that little moment of safety, of room, of safety for speaking up because they're doing it and you're listening. And so I think if people at work were able to more reliably focus on what they can do rather than what they can't do, it's a very powerful perspective. So sure, I don't have
Mm.
a magic wand. I can't fix everything, but I can show up, right? I can show up in such a way that lets other people know that I'm interested, that I care. I can take small risks myself. I can share things that I got this idea. It might not be very good. I'll just try it, right? And then more often than not, people really won't respond negatively. More often
Mm.
than not, people will respond like, well, that's interesting. I'd like to think about it more. Or I'm not sure that would work, but hey, cool idea. I mean, it's the sort of bad things we imagine might happen rarely do.
Yes, this is also so, so, so true. And I'd like you to speak to that because I, I'll never forget an experience that I had at one of the companies that I worked for a few years ago. And I was driving with a colleague, a younger colleague. I was driving, she was sitting next to me, and we were just chatting about things. And then she shared some of the frustrations that she had with our team and our company. And when I asked her whether she addressed this issue with the person that the problem was, she said, no,
Oh,
I
of course not.
haven't. And I said, what makes you think that she wouldn't be responsive to that? And she said, well, you just don't do those things. It's impossible,
Right.
you know. And I know for a fact that this specific person would listen and would be
Mhm.
open. So I'm wondering, where is this coming
Yeah,
from? Because it seemed a little bit like a myth. You just don't do those things, but it was never really tested in reality.
absolutely. Well, the statement, "It was never tested in reality," is so powerful because we are full of assumptions that we're making, some of them consciously, some of them unconsciously, that don't get tested. And in part because there's an asymmetry, right? We believe, if we believe it to be the case that he will react badly, we don't want to test it. Right? Well,
Mm-hmm.
since that's probably right,
Yeah.
why would I want to test it? I mean, why would I
True.
put myself through that?
True.
And yet, I would argue more often, far more often than not, the assumptions we make are wrong, are overly negative about how other people will react
Mm.
to our weakness, our question, our mistake. And most people are really delighted to discover that you're a human being too.
Mm-hmm.
We actually so appreciate shows of vulnerability in other people.
Mm.
And so there's this funny asymmetry in that, because if we really stopped to recognize that, maybe we'd be willing to take more risks, which would also be the same thing as willing to test these
Mm.
things. But also, Jim Dieter, who was a PhD student of mine and now a full professor at UVA, Jim Dieter and I did a study a number of years ago that directly spoke to this issue, and we called it implicit theories of voice, which is rather academic sounding, but it's exactly what we're talking about here, which is these sort of taken for granted beliefs about what's done at work and
Mm-hmm.
what isn't done at work. If you have some kind of idea that things could be done better, you don't tell a boss about it because that boss might think you're criticizing him or her. And so that's an implicit theory. The
Yeah,
implicit theory is that your improvement idea will be felt as criticism, and you just wouldn't want to do that. When
I
in
love that.
reality, that manager might in fact be delighted by
Mm-hmm.
your improvement idea, or not,
Mm.
might be neutral. Who cares, right? But we
Yeah.
we bring this, and Jim and I talked about it as a set of implicit theories about what you do and don't speak up about, and under what conditions you do and don't speak. And you can, and we were able to document a very large number of people holding fairly high scores on those theories. And you can step back and realize the impact of that on work, on knowledge work, and especially on innovation work is profound.
Hmm. Yes, I can only imagine. As you were speaking, I just realized that I personally have been a victim to taking those implicit theories as gospel in
Mm,
my personal career, where I was working for a company in a country, and then for personal reasons I needed to be in a different country because my husband was moved to
right.
to another country, and my assumption was that it was not possible for me to
To speak.
move to
Hmm.
that other country and still continue work for the company. So I basically
Oh,
continued going back and forth until and when people ask me, why haven't you talked to your boss, maybe he would be okay with it, I was just like, no way, this is just not
yep.
happening. And especially now I'm going for promotion, there's just
Oh,
no chance.
right, right.
And then my boss comes to me at some point and he says, listen, I've been watching you for a few months. I think that if you are forced to do this longer, you will probably
Mm,
leave us. And I don't want you. So I want you
oh,
to stay.
right.
So let's try to figure out a solution that is going to work both for you and for the company. And I was astonished because that just spoke completely against what I was absolutely 100% convinced would never be possible. And so I eventually moved to Italy, still continued to work for that company, and I did get my promotion at the same time.
Well, I like to say, the sort of most profound, human shortcoming we have is the belief that we know. And the story you just told is a story where you're 100% sure that your diagnosis of the situation is correct, right? You don't see it as your diagnosis, you see it as reality itself. And then that gets in the way of you challenging it, testing it, getting curious about it, all of that stuff. And it's not your fault. It's like your brain is doing that to you.
Because I think we have this bias towards certainty rather than not knowing. So we'd rather jump into a conclusion than stay in this uncomfortable place of trying to figure out what really is true. So what is your take on how do you cultivate that mindset of continuously challenging your own assumptions so that your relationship with reality is healthier?
It's not easy, right? There's no simple solution, but I think it's a combination of two things. And one, it's just, it's cultivating a mindset of curiosity, which is not unlike a growth mindset, right? I mean, continually reminding yourself that your brain is lying to you, that it tells you, things like intelligence are fixed and the reality is fixed, when in fact, you can always poke at it. You can always go around the other side and see something else going on, right? So that sort of self-talk and self-reminder to embrace more of a curiosity growth mindset. But number two is cultivate that as a norm in a team or a norm in a workplace, because it's if you really get serious about how do we challenge reality, that's a team sport. Right? Challenging reality is darn hard for individuals. But when you and I team up to do it, we sort of spur each other on. Well, what if? What might happen if we tried it this way or thought about it that way? So it's not only more fun to do it with other people, it's actually more productive.
Yes, I love that. So for our listeners, this is a great, for example, idea of how you can pair up with someone and just see things slightly differently by brainstorming together and challenging one another's or each other's assumptions. Love that. I know that you don't have that much time, so we will need to shift gears and move to the rapid fire questions. And I have 5 questions for you. I'll ask these questions in rapid succession. And the idea is that you'll try to answer them in under 2 minutes.
I'll do my best.
Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent. So the first one is, how do you define organizational culture?
The way things are around here. Culture
and
is...
what?
Yeah, sorry.
That's all right. And what would be the signs that a company culture needs some work or perhaps even a major overhaul?
For me, the most important sign is tiptoeing. And I don't mean literal tiptoeing up on your toes, but a sense of, it's palpable when there's a sense of caution, a sense of wait and see. I can't just jump in. I need to read the tea leaves.
And are there any companies that you admire for their culture? And if yes, why?
I admire Pixar for its culture. It has cultivated a culture of speaking up and candor and creativity and willingness to get it wrong in service of getting it right eventually.
Are there any books on culture or on leadership that you would recommend? And I would certainly, by the way, recommend your books, and we'll put links to your books in the show notes. But who inspires you, or who do you learn from?
Well, I love the book, The Culture Code by Daniel Coyle. I think it's one of the best books on culture. I mean, just absolutely readable, engaging, page turner, wonderful book.
Oh, great stories. Yeah, I love it too. And what is one thing that our listeners can do tomorrow so that they build their own culture lab and start cultivating the sort of culture that will help them and their teams to bring their vision to life?
Force yourself to ask 2 good questions every day. And one good question should be the kind that help us go deeper. Why do you think that? What might happen if? And one good question should be the type that help us go broader. Like, what other options are there? What might we be missing? Who has a different perspective?
Oh, I love that. Deeper and broader. Love that. And finally, what are your final thoughts? What would you like to leave our listeners with?
I would like to leave your listeners with the awareness that they are so much more powerful than they think in terms of making a difference in other people's culture and at work. Right? So you can show up. How you show up matters. Show up, bring your full self forward, be interested in what others are thinking and doing and feeling, and go ahead and make that difference.
That's wonderful. I can't think of a better way to end this. And I want to thank you again for the work that you've done over the past decades, because I really think it's been game changing for organizations. And it's been incredibly helpful for so many people, so many organizations that I know of who are now more aware of the fact that psychological safety is important, and also have tips and guidelines and ideas from you and from your colleagues on how to cultivate it. So thank you, and please keep doing this work.
You are welcome, and I so appreciate your interest.
And if anyone would like to learn more about what you are up to and what you are working on at the moment, what is the best place for them to visit, online or offline?
At the moment, the best place is to go to the Harvard Business School website and just search my name, and you'll get to my faculty page, and that lists articles and books and videos and various other things.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Amy.
You're very welcome.
I'm Aga Bayer, the creator and host of the Culture Lab podcast, and this is the Culture Lab team.
Production Manager, Lindsay Nunez.
Art Director, Emily Spencer.
Aaron Scott, Content Editor.
Sound Producer, James Eade, Be Heard.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Culture Lab podcast. Amy and I hope that it will inspire you to think broader and deeper about cultivating psychological safety at your company. And if you'd like an opportunity to interact with guests of the Culture Lab podcast in live sessions where you can learn more on the topic, well, this is just one of many benefits that you would enjoy if you were a member of the CultureBrained community. So CultureBrained is a one-of-a-kind global community for culture leaders who look for new ways of cultivating remarkable cultures in this brave new world of remote and hybrid work. So if you're in charge of a culture-shaping project, and if you believe that work should be synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging, you'd probably feel right at home in our community. It's a really, really diverse group of culture leaders, from Fortune 100 to tiny startups. And what brings us together is a passion for cultivating a healthy culture at scale. We are guided by our values of being bold, being kind, and being curious. And we'd love for you to join if it feels like the right fit for you. You can learn more at tiny.one/CultureBrained. You'll find the link in the show notes. Thanks for tuning in and listening to this episode of the Culture Lab podcast. If you found any moments that were interesting, inspiring, or maybe even game-changing, please share this episode with someone who'd appreciate it. After all, good ideas are meant to be shared. If you haven't subscribed to the Culture Lab yet, you can do it on any podcast streaming platform of your choice. If you want to receive our weekly insights on cultivating a remarkable, powerful, and authentic company culture, especially in a business that scales, type this into your browser: tinyurl.com/Aga Bayer. That's tinyurl.com/AGABAJER. Also, we would be ever so grateful if you could rate and review our podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to it. And finally, the entire Culture Lab team and our guests, we are going to continue exploring how we can make the word work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging, and how we can build remarkable cultures that scale as our businesses grow and the world keeps on changing. So, what do you want to hear about next? What matters to you? Email us at lindsay@agabayer.com and let us know.